Welcome back, everyone. It was good to see so many people jumping around the tables and stuff. So yeah, I'd just like to invite the panelists onto the stage. So we can see Etienne and Tom. If we can have Dane as well, and hi, Annalise. There we go. And Dean. Hopefully, I've seen Dean around somewhere. Dean Marsh. I bet he's gone off to get a coffee or something. There he is. Hi, Dean.
There we go. Good.
Unmute your mics. I'll just do a very quick round the table. So just a very quick introduction. We've got joining us on the panel this morning, Annalise Johns from the Connected Property Catapult. Hi, Annalise. You've already met Dane, who's the Managing Director of IoT Assets. Hi, Dane. We're joined by Dean Marsh, who's ICT Officer at Mid Wales Housing Association. We've got Dr. Etienne Roche, who's an Associate Professor at the University of Reading. Hi, Etienne. And last but by no means least, we've got Tom Way, who's the Strategy Manager of L&Q. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Cool. Right then, let's get cracking. So I'm going to start off with a nice simple question just to warm us up. Is 2020 the year of IoT in social housing? All right, we're just going to have a simple yes or no, and I'll just go around the table. So starting with Annalise.
Maybe not 2020, but maybe 2021. So I'll say no.
Okay, that's good. Dane, I think we've already had your answer, but go on, give it to me again.
Not yet, no.
Dean?
Yeah, it's still growing, a lot going on. But yeah, from the housing side of it, people are starting to pick up on the benefits. So yeah, I think another year is going to start taking off.
So a yes or no?
Yes.
Good man. Etienne?
Yes, I was convinced that it would come up soon, and I think the lockdown had just made things more apparent. So even if people don't have IoT devices in their houses right now, everybody's thinking about it even more than before. So yes.
Ooh, I like it. Tom?
So I'm going to simply say no and look forward to explaining my answer shortly.
Well, I'm going to say yes. A, to be contrary, but B, to make it a nice tie-break situation. 3 yeses and 3 no's. Hey, this is what debate is about. So I'll tell you what then, Tom. Kick off with your kind of underlying reasoning behind your answer.
Okay, so the reason why 2020 isn't the year of IoT in social housing is that, like in most industries, 2020 is the year of COVID-19 in social housing. So the technology and working trends which emerge from this year will be those created by the conditions determined by the pandemic response. This does include many opportunities, many areas of opportunity for innovation. So the sense that with the right access to the right information, people can work from anywhere. The COVID-19 experience has also led to operators rethinking their traditional ways of working in order to be resilient to all types of risk. Therefore, the conditions might be created to enable a strategic shift towards IoT-based solutions. As Dane spoke about, the IoT deal that we've heard about is really welcome news for the sector. I'm really excited to see the ripple effect that this does have in shifting mindsets towards modern technology-based service models. But I don't think that is this year.
Okay. Okay, nice and succinct, like it. Dean, you're a yes man.
Yeah, from our experience, especially sort of air quality, monitoring the properties with the COVID thing, I think it's going to start. Yeah, it's going to play a huge importance, I think, in monitoring what's going on out there for us. So yeah,
you're at the coalface to a certain respect, Dean, as an ICT officer at a housing association. I mean, just give me some examples where you think, your business is looking in terms of IoT.
Great. Okay. So from our experience already, we can detect if the properties have been abandoned, if there's damp condensation issues. We even, back in the cold winter we had, we detected in a property where it dropped below -5 in there. There was an elderly gentleman. So that triggered an automatic alert and a housing officer went out there. So we potentially saved him from hypothermia. So we saw straight away the huge potential there with IoT. So yeah, the guys, they sorted him out, heating allowance, got his heating up and running. So he was happy. Without that, we'd have no idea what's going on really.
So a good example of an actual real life use case of that IoT. Cool. Annalise, you a no?
Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons I've said no is because the majority of our housing provision and the social housing provision is actually coming from local authorities, and they are in a panic right now about just getting their ducks in a row. They're really trying to support people who are vulnerable, who have really suffered, and part of that is making sure they've not been expelled from their properties. So I think right now we're fighting a lot of fires, and also as a sector as a whole, there's still a huge uncertainty about who owns that data and what the purpose of holding that data is, and also residents just having grave concerns about who has data on their properties. So I think we haven't resolved those issues in any way, shape, or form. We're also fighting fires. So with that in mind, I think, no, we're not quite there.
Okay. No, I can see that point of view. Etienne, your perspective on your answer, yes.
So I think that there are many reasons why it hasn't taken off right now, and I'm sure we can go to that again. The alignment between what the user understands, what the housing association needs, and the equation between these things, and where the data fits in there. I think it's a big thing. I answered yes because I just see the cost of managing all these properties and the benefit of using these devices to preempt issues or to troubleshoot. And I think that from my understanding of how the sector works, I don't see any way without it.
Okay, that's a fair one. Dane, your perspective, mate.
Yeah, I think I probably said it all in my presentation, but I'm technically a no for this year, but this year is very quickly blending into next year. I can't believe we're in July already. But I think one of my issues with the whole thing and why it's not taking off is even just calling it IoT, the Internet of technology really in most people's heads, is it makes it sound overcomplicated. And then really it's not. I mean, having a chat with Dean before this whole thing kicked off, it was so good to see somebody who had actually just gone, do you know what, I can do this. It's really simple. And he's gone and done it himself. And that's it. The system, once we get better understanding of it, the systems are generally so easy to use. And I mean, our IOPT was actually a rebranding of our previous company, Internet of Power Things, to Internet of Property Things. And I think that's what we need to say is this is really specific to the sector, and the tech is really simple. And going back to my presentation, that's the thing is we need to make it easy. And that's not just in the price, but in deployment and in how you use it on a daily basis. That's my big thing about the whole thing.
Okay, I mean, I came at this from a yes, initially out of optimism. So I posed this question right at the beginning of the year. So this is all pre-COVID. And that was based on experience over this past 6 years of talking to the sector about IoT from a supplier perspective. And it's interesting, you mentioned, the fact that the technology now is simple, but the fact that it's technology is a barrier. And, being on the other side of being in a completely different space now with a consultant, engaging both with suppliers and with executives in housing associations, there is something in that. If you can talk the language of housing in the way that they do housing operationally and ignore the technology to a certain extent, they become a lot more engaged with it. If you focus on, the sensor itself or how that sensor functions or the mechanisms of how the sensor connects data, once you start going down that track, the glaze comes over. But if you can talk about how many reduced no access calls you get, or if you can say, I can move us from a reactive maintenance cycle of boilers to proactive, and therefore it does X, Y, Z. If you can talk about the operational factors, I think you get a lot more traction. So based on the experiences and the conversations I had up to COVID, that's why I was fairly confident that 2020 was going to be the year it would kick off. And, I take on board, the current situation we operate within, which is what Tom was saying. And of course, what Annalise was supporting there. There is a lot of firefighting going on, but I think we're starting to come out at the back end of that. And it's awful. Everyone moans about the term the new normal, but unfortunately it is. And I'm interested to see that already there's a number of organizations that are pivoting to tech like IoT. So that's why I'm still a yes man, even with everything going on. Okay. We touched on it a little bit, and I know you touched on it in your presentation, Dan, but I think I'd like to go to Etienne and pose this question about the barriers to widespread adoption of IoT, not so much the technology, but the concept of IoT social housing. So can I go to you, Etienne, with your thoughts on that?
Sure, yeah. So it might be a bit helpful for me to explain who I am. I'm an academic. I'm not an industry person. I do research in psychology. And I guess the reason why I'm standing on that stage today is that I've met Stuart a few years ago when I was in a project looking at how users or tenants are using IoT and how they react when things go wrong. So what we did in this project was we provided tenants with a set of devices. There were lights and sensors and all kinds of things. And we just looked at how they used them. And then because it was a particular context in this project, it was cybersecurity, we started interacting with these devices remotely. And all of a sudden the light would turn on, or Alexa would run the radio at the time when you didn't really expect it to, and so on. And so we just wanted to see how users reacted to these things. And we have a lot of data. We're still analyzing it, but what I can say is that I think that users, regardless of whether they are tech wizards or not, they really do not understand IoT. Nobody noticed really that we were interacting with these devices at random times for a period of 3 months. And so we're talking about, the Philips Hue light bulb changing color, or turning on and off, or the radio turning on, or the different sensors we played with, and these sort of things. So these were pretty big things. And so I think that the main barrier that we will be facing is the adequation between what the users actually know, understand, and know how to use versus what you guys in the sector generally actually need. So air quality is one thing, but tenants don't necessarily care to have a reading of air quality, and it doesn't really mean much to them. Yeah. And so my feeling is that in the sector of IoT generally, it's a sector driven by industry. They will push devices to you and said, hey, look, you need this sensor that can read this and give you this number. But the user, they really don't understand what that means anyway.
Okay.
And I think that one of the biggest barrier.
There's an interesting point there. So Dean, you've got live stuff going on now in tenants' properties. Was there a conversation you had with tenants?
Yeah, we spoke to them about it. What we did initially, when the properties become void, we put the sensors in then, and as the tenants were going in, we'd explain what was being monitored in there, and they were perfectly fine with it. So yeah, no issues there. We get a lot of condensation issues in the properties, whereas previously we would go out there and probably spend thousands and try to change bits and pieces in the property. Whereas now we go out, we'll fit a load of sensors in there. We'll give the tenants access to the dashboard so they can see the environmental data in there as well. And we found that they're really interested in it. They'll start opening windows and venting the property, and you can work with them like that. So just that little bit of data we found.
So some interesting
counterpoints
there from Etienne's research. Where there needs to be some kind of connection between the tenant and what's actually happening. But it's interesting your point, Dean, because I would have thought, they wouldn't have been that interested in seeing a load of data.
So it's that kind of like sort of education as well, how your lifestyle affects the property. So the guys could see, for example, if they're drying the laundry in the property, they see a huge spike in humidity going up to the ceiling. So they can see with that they need to open the windows and vent it, and then you gradually see the graph just kind of plateauing like that.
The points that you come out there remind me of a few years ago when I was involved in a pilot project, and it's something that Annalise said earlier on. This kind of trust factor. Why are you putting these things in, and what are you actually going to capture? One of the things we did in that pilot was bring tenants in. We actually, with the housing association, they went out to their tenant group and had like an open call for people to be involved in the pilot. And they brought them all together and then very clearly articulated, this is why we're doing this pilot. This is what's going to go into your property. This is why we're capturing it. And this is what you can get access to. So it was almost like, we're going to just head this issue, right head on. We're not going to pretend about why we're doing this. We're going to try and involve the tenants all in. Tom, I know you've looked at this off and on for years. What's your experiences around the barriers to it? Is it predominantly tenants, or is it more the organisation having a kind of barrier to looking at IoT?
Well, I think there's a mixture there. So, predominantly, I think it's the organisation itself presents a barrier because IoT has to be part of a strategic narrative of what you're trying to achieve. From a tenant's perspective, I think we have to really segregate when we're talking about social housing, the consumer market and the kind of products which are available to us as housing associations, because I'm to raise a controversial point. I'm yet to be convinced by many, if any, in-home devices which consumers don't purchase themselves, and I think it's really the IoT which you can get for business performance which presents the biggest opportunity. So if you don't mind, I'll just go into what I believe the barriers to the sort of IoT for facilities management and operational performance are. So I think ultimately unlocking all forms of innovation in social housing is about improving the way that we manage risk. So if you look across the sector, you'll find that the highest risk work is often outsourced to specialists. That includes care and support, repairs and maintenance, and gas safety. So for housing providers at the moment, that might mean that you've got very expensive contracts in place, but it also means that the risk is carried by a specialist third party rather than yourself. So these kind of asset-based approaches to IoT, so for example, monitoring let's take an example of your emergency lighting, that really enables the shift to managing assets by exception. There's many efficiencies that come with doing that, but it also potentially brings in the risk of in-house management of those assets and that piece of work which you haven't managed before and you haven't carried that risk before. So therefore, I think that the real barrier is the current ways of working within the sort of the housing providers that aren't necessarily set up to allow the benefits of IoT to be actualized. But I guess that being said, these challenges are not insurmountable, and I guess the challenges facing us as organisations in the 21st century, so to end homelessness in the midst of a worsening housing crisis, play our part in combating climate change, making homes healthy and safe, and keeping the costs of, say, leasehold and service charges down. They do need 21st century ideas, they need 21st century technology, and they need 21st century service models, which means that these kind of things, the way that we provide service in the future and what we use to provide that service needs to be kind of close to the heart of our long-term corporate strategies in order for us to deliver those at the right time. because you've also got contracts in place for several years, which when we've talked in the past about IoT being kind of achieving multiple benefits, delivering against multiple KPIs, and actually, if you've got two contracts that end at different times, which the IoT solution could improve the performance on both, then actually it becomes a really difficult administrative challenge to actually implement that unless it's at the heart of your strategy.
There was a point you made right at the beginning of what you said, which I thought was really interesting. You know, when we look at sensor packages, which are very much around the property and the built environment, you know, things like CO, you know, damp, humidity. Is this boring? Is it boring to the tenant? Whereas you look at IoT or connected type smart devices that are more geared towards person, you know, is it you know, more attractive to them? I'm thinking of organizations like Alcove who make a lifestyle. You know, they promote a lifestyle when it comes to their connected devices. So I'm interested to go to Dane as a supplier of this sort of technology. You know, how do you make your packages attractive to the organization, but you know, do you think about the tenant in mind and about how they'd engage with your tech?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the first 2 years of IoT being in place, I spent basically running around the country installing sensors. So I got a lot of interaction with tenants. So it would have been about 200, 250 properties, something like that, for pilot projects. And the vast majority of people, and not having come from a housing or a property background, I fully expected there to be a fair amount of pushback, but that was my lack of understanding and knowledge of the sector from the tenant. And the vast majority of people, their reaction was, it's just great to know they're doing something proactive. Now, we did, of course, get some people who had a bit of a big brother idea about it, saying, well, are you not just spying? Once we explained exactly what it was for, and at that stage, it was mainly about predictive maintenance kind of stuff, it was fine. But going back to, I think, what Tom was saying, and Dean actually, or well, in fact, what everybody said really is, once you engage with the tenant and you show them the data, they are actually really engaged with it. And the biggest thing from my point of view was, once you were able to show a tenant the data, even if they hadn't had access to it, if they had a complaint about condensation or saying that their heating or whatever wasn't working, nobody argued with it. They all went, oh, okay, yeah, right, now I get it. And they really understood how their actions, good, bad, or indifferent, were impacting the property. So we find really positive, surprisingly to me, really positive interactions. And one of the projects we did with Leeds City Council was about developing the app to give the tenants more interaction with what was going on. And we did quite a big study with their tenants with National Energy Action, and we found exactly the same feedback as I had received in the first 2 years, just randomly talking to tenants, was that as long as the tenants understood what it was being used for and that it could benefit them as well as the property, then they were really positive about it. So wasn't what I was expecting, but it's a good thing. But
okay, I mean, I want to explore this idea of you know, the personal connection of a tenant to the kind of technology with Etienne in a moment, but I want to go to Annalise and give Annalise the opportunity to talk about, you know, your experiences at the Catapult with, you know, when you're looking at the sector and you're looking at organizations who want to get into the sector, you know, what comes back to you and your thoughts about barriers of entry, especially in social housing?
Well, I think one of the problems the housing sector has is that, I mean, it's terribly siloed, but it's just lacking standard data be shared across the board, which sounds so small and sounds so weak, but we really do have the most complex housing stock. And you think about the technologies that we've adapted into our homes for centuries, it really makes it quite a conundrum. So while I support the ability to have data extracted from our homes and the use of sensors, I think there's a couple things. One, I know that the caliber of sensor is just not there yet. We can't really get the accurate data, and we should be actually getting the multiple points simultaneously rather than just a piecemeal approach to make sure that we're actually able to look at the occupant's health throughout the property's use. And that's something we really can't do right now. And one of the reasons is because we really don't have an accurate audit of each property and how it's functioning. So that is a serious barrier at the moment. And it's not insurmountable. We've got a wonderful amount of AI companies that are able to survey properties and give us accurate information, but scaling that up is very difficult. So marrying those two, I think, is a real opportunity. But I think there's also the problem, I think, across the housing sector that we're also having is that we really look at everything in a very short-term focus. We really need to be looking at all of our properties as it should be future fit. And so that's really about creating properties that suit all generations at all times. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because, you kind of don't want to go into an occupant's house and be putting in sensors every so often. You want to make sure that it's actually able to adapt over time so you don't have to intervene. And I think it's really powerful to build those technologies with the occupant, but also with the multi-generational occupant, because obviously what Generation Z is going to want in that home versus what our baby boomers want, it's going to be different. So we don't know the fluctuations between generations into our homes right now. I just think we need to kind of take a much more systems approach. And I think part of that is really adapting, just basically understanding sort of the demographic, political, and economic challenges that are facing our population change, and really asking ourselves, what is the intention for putting in the IoT in our home, and really having a standard approach. And my thought is we should be developing our homes to be fit for the future, but also fit for human health. And at the moment, no house is being measured for that. So if we created a single voice effectively for our housing stock, that we make things fit for human occupation and then add sensors accordingly, then we all know that we're setting our bar at an equally held view and standard of quality. So yeah, in terms of the obstacles, I think there are a few. It's a little bit complicated and a lot of it's process driven, but you know what? The government actually always follows what industry is doing. So I think the route that we're taking right now is always the right way.
It's interesting you bring it up, because I mean it's very timely, because obviously today it was announced that the big push from UK government around potentially giving inefficiently heated households £5,000 voucher. And that we have our housing stock is the worst performing in Europe in terms of energy efficiency. Now, obviously, if we all had sensors, because this was part of the idea behind the smart metering project, was to get this kind of data about energy consumption. And we know that the smart meter program is just a movable feast. It's funny that the presentation I showed back at 2014, where I said the government had committed to finishing smart metering in 2020, was after they'd moved it again, and we're still not there. So yeah, I mean the barriers, structurally and politically are massive. So thanks for that, Annelies. I wanted to go back to Etienne, as we had this little thread about the connection between a tenant and these kind of devices and any barriers there. I wanted to come back to you, Etienne, because we had a point raised by Matthew Gardner about data, saying that if HAs paid tenants something, whether it be a rebate on their rent or whatever, for the collection of that data, he then said gamification off the back of IoT data would be interesting to explore. Have you got something to say around that, Etienne, about the personal connection and concepts like gamification when it comes to data?
Not so much about gamification, but the concept of data and privacy is definitely something that came back on and on and on during our interviews and during all the studies and experiments we ran. From the tenant who was used to technology to the tenant who had no idea what this was about. Obviously, it depends on which devices you would put in. So, for example, Alexa was a big warn, big red sign because Alexa is always listening, and you don't know where it is storing data, where it is analyzing data, and how it can be used. And at the time, so it was a couple of years back. At the time, Alexa was it had a few issues, like it would randomly laugh in the middle of. I don't know if you remember that.
I've experienced it.
Yeah.
Very disconcerting.
It was, and actually it was a very weird laugh as well, so very creepy. And so tenants freaked out about these sort of things. And so obviously, if it's just a CO2 sensor, they will see the use of it and they will not be so concerned so much. But as technology progresses, as these things become more complex, the tenants will react really strongly to these things.
Okay, that's good. I wanted to follow up a little bit on some of the points that Annelies made as well. Standardization, has been the bugbear of technology in housing for the 25 plus years. I mean, there'll be people in the audience. I'm going to go back in time. I was part of the adapters club, talk about the mists of time. And that was literally like herding cats, putting a load of local authorities in a room, just looking at housing data standards. It was a nightmare. But I've got to give a shout out to HACT, because they've put a lot of effort into coming up with, data standardization around, specific key lines of business in housing. So there's at least a direction of travel there. And I imagine HACT, because they've been, active in the world of IoT for as long as I've been involved in it. I'm sure, this whole point of data standards is something they're looking at as well. But there was an element of tech in what Annelies was talking about, and I get this back from HAs. They're worried about engaging in IoT projects with suppliers like Dane, with SmartRent, with SafeCility, etc., because they see inbuilt redundancy of the tech, and they're, probably because of the consumer experience. A lot of people change their phone every single year when a new version comes out. Well, that's great as a consumer, but if you're putting 10,000 sensor packages in property, you can't change it every year. It's got to have like a 5 or 10 year life cycle. So I'm interested to see if there's been any examples, whether it be from Tom or Dane or even Annelies in what you've been doing with Catapult, whether you've seen suppliers understand that there's a capital investment which needs to be recouped, and kind of looking at the more, I'll use the example of Tesla model, where you have a fixed hardware package, which is the car. And what you do is you look at leveraging software and the combination of software and the hardware you've got to do new things. I mean, I've got a Tesla, so the greatest example is when I had my Model S back in 2017, it didn't have automatic wipers. There's no wiper sensor. So that was actually retrograde compared to the car I had before. But then they actually use the cameras and the other packages and create software. So they actually create the same functionality, but through software. So it looks like, Annelies, you got something to say on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things that, what's happening in the housing sector, it's always so slow to get there. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And that's absolutely fine. But one of the things that we're learning about the housing sector is that it really needs to incorporate itself in the wider infrastructure within the built environment. And so in order to do that and to make sense of all the individual components, the digital twin is actually becoming a really important resource to do that, whereby you can actually do a modeling of, the forecasting of, and that then peters down into changing systems that are existing and thereby creating more agility at that base level using a digital twin. And so I think the real estate sector is the biggest push towards using digital twins, which I think is really interesting. And I think we're learning a lot from being able to apply sort of system thinking and also, as somebody's mentioned already, game theory as well, to kind of get a geographic modeling and sort of to understand some sort of forecasting as to what those technologies are going to need to do, what sort of future fitness or resilience needs to be adapted, and thereby creating sort of materials or energy sources or what have you to adapt to that. So I think it's all kind of happening together and at pace. So no, I don't believe that there is one specific stream where things are happening, because everything's sort of simultaneously coming into each other, where this built environment systems of infrastructure is sort of helping itself to adapt to a future fitness, if that makes any sense.
No, and I'm keen about your digital twin bit, because I look at the rise of digital twins and the importance of digital twins and think, well, actually, that looks to me like a great case for IoT. And I always say there's a good case for IoT in social housing, because it has that great double responsibility for the property and responsibility to a certain degree for the people living in it and how they live in it. And, I'm sure I'm not saying anything out of turn when I say the vast majority of housing associations operate on severely low data sets when it comes to how their properties actually perform. There's not many HAs that consistently do 100% stock condition surveys. So actually, if you go down the stream of digital twins using actually a low data set, yes, you might do modeling in the twin, but your modeling could be completely out. Whereas if you're capturing data through sensors, actually you're going to get a much greater understanding when you then apply it to the twin. So it was interesting that bit coming out.
Well, I think the thing with the digital twin is that it's not about those micro details. That's what it's enabling you to do. You can actually model something without having the minutia of detail, which is really needed. It's needed if you want to just kind of start putting some future projections on where we need to create future agility. And so that's really the benefit of it, that because this is it, we don't have the data that we need to be able to make the interventions that we've got, even though all the colleagues here are clearly working with, the fact that Dean's got this incredible capability to identify mold or temperature differentiation. That's super, super important. And the one place where we need that more than ever is working with clients who are being discharged from the NHS. My God, work with the Better Care Fund. My God, you revolutionized the country, full stop. So yeah, I think there's a need for marrying and escalating how we collect, but also not how, but also the accuracy of that detail. And doesn't mean we need lots of data. It just means we need the right data. And there is a in between that we haven't been able to do that. And that's why the digital twin is kind of enabling us to kind of circumnavigate that for.
Is this something, Dane, that you've had to look at?
Yeah. It's the balance of how much data you can get in, how accurate it can be, and the cost of it. It's quite simple, really. And it's not just cost, financial cost, but there's energy costs. For example, we have to use a more expensive CO2 sensor because it's ultra low power, because that then lets the battery last longer. And it means it might cost us 30 quid more for the sensor, but if it means that you don't have to do 2 battery replacements, that's 150 quid right there. The data side of it, we have tried a lot of different sensors and measuring a lot of different bits and pieces. So for example, noise, whenever we first started doing this, we started measuring noise levels. Didn't really give us anything. It wasn't really any value to that. So we stopped using that pretty quickly. And really what we've had to do is balance what we measure with the amount of value we get back from it. And the digital twin thing is great. I'm never quite sure about the different terminologies. It's a bit like blockchain. I've never understood that, but you know, where we can get the value is in what we think we measure now, but also then what you were saying about bringing in more value further down the line. We can do that by bringing in open source data sets like weather, or whether it's deprivation indexes or outdoor air quality, different things like that. And we keep on adding value in by adding in these different things by quite simply talking to our customers. So we're finding that we're using as simple data as possible at the bottom end of the scale, if you like, and then adding more value on the further up the chain we get. So yeah, I mean, simple things like over-the-air updates for our technology. We can upgrade the sensor. But at the end of the day, as you said, or somebody said, you have an initial CapEx, which is pretty big. They're not necessarily massive compared to some other CapEx spends. And you don't want to be redoing that every 3 or 5 years or whatever, but you do want to be getting as much value out of it. And that's what it comes down to at the end of the day is, you know, driving as much value out of it as possible.
And that's a point I want to go to Tom on. I'm going to stay on this thread of the data at the moment and go to Tom, Etienne, and Dean. But Tom, that you know, that concept of the value of the data that you capture. I mean, this is something that we spoke about last week, and you came up with the cracker, which was the fact that it's very difficult for housing organisations to engage with IoT and see it as a value proposition, because actually the KPIs that they measure and track don't really fit with IoT, and therefore you need to create a whole new set of KPIs. Do you want to sort of expand a bit more on that?
Yeah, that's correct. So that's kind of references to back what I was saying, what I said previously, which is that you need kind of 21st century business models to solve the 21st century problems, and therefore in order to I guess realize the theoretical benefits of the kind of connected property, connected estate, you would need to be I don't necessarily have the answer, but you'd need to be measuring your performance in a very different way. And this is why, again, as I was alluding to previously, for me, the first steps for IoT to really have to make gains within the sector is to deliver risk management functions which we already carry out, but demonstrating a much significantly lower cost over the lifetime of the project than the way that we currently work. So we have again, talk about the same thing. We have outsourced services which look after our emergency lighting. I know there's technology which is able to enable us to manage emergency lighting by exception. Straight away, you're seeing efficiencies there. However, I guess the difficult bit to unpick is how those contracts are managed and how you, using your IoT, can make that outsourced service lower cost, yet do the same job, give the same assurance as those existing services do. For me, that's the first place, and then the sector becomes more comfortable with IoT, and then we can start looking about how we add value, how we add new services, how we better look after vulnerable people, and we can develop targeted IoT services to support the particular people that we need to provide extra help to. So yeah, that's my point. I had another thing, but it's gone.
That's right. No, I want to go to Dean, because obviously, Dean, you know, this idea of data and benefit and value, not just to tenants but to the organisation as well.
Sure.
Can you just take us through what led your organisation to do this LoRa project that you've
Right, quite an interesting story.
Oh, and welcome back, by the way.
Yeah, we've had a few power disruptions here, so I do apologise today. It keeps going off. So it all started with myself. Like the immersion heater in the house, I completely changed the mechanism to work with it, so it's digital, so I could measure the temperature and set the temperature correctly on it like a few years ago. And I was showing the guys in work what data I could get from immersion heater with on-off, power usage, temperature. And at the time, I think it was just a bit before sort of LoRaWAN was out there. We spoke about being able to, how useful it would be to get the data and metrics from our properties, but the technology at the time, we'd have to install Ethernet cabling in the flats or SIM cards like that, so it just wasn't cost effective. I skip a few years forward. I was out in Amsterdam with my friends out there, and they were tracking assets, bicycles, using LoRaWAN GPS nodes, and obviously no SIM card needed, and one gateway can serve thousands of nodes. So I come back and it was just floating in my head with that. So we went out and bought the hardware, put the gateway on the building, and just bought a collection of sensors and put them into properties and started experimenting that way.
So being a board member, how did you get this through? What did you just? Was it discretionary fund? What? Right. It's not often that someone goes, "Oh, let's go and buy some LoRa kit."
Sure. One of the guys downstairs, he had a bit of the cost of the equipment. Like this typical gateway is £400 to £500, and then the sensors we're using to 30 to 40. So we found some spare money somewhere, a budget we used for sort of experimenting, and went from there with it really. And it was all self-taught. Learned the technology from scratch myself. Newtown, Wales was the first gateway we put in, and straight away with the data coming in, we could see how useful that was. But the LoRaWANs enable us to not use SIM cards or not require an internet connection on site, which is ideal because a lot of the tenants don't have internet, and the mobile phone signal in a rural location is very intermittent. So LoRaWAN, you can just roll it out yourself and provide coverage.
So how long has this project been going?
The project, second year now. So still fairly new.
So focusing back in on again on this theme of the data, have you gained insights from the data? Is there something that you can share, or what's your experience from the data perspective?
We can from the data we can see if the property's been abandoned remotely. Condensation issues, that seems to be the main one there. That saved us a lot of money in a few areas by putting sensors in and seeing the data coming in and proving it's a lifestyle issue and whether tenants can make tweaks. The guys at development, they've seen the potential of it. So a lot of the new developments now are being fitted with the MCF88 sensor, which combines temperature, humidity, CO2, VOC, air pressure, light, whole lot. So we're getting real-time sort of asset management back from the properties there.
Okay.
So the general cost is really low.
There's something you pointed out there, which is in the collection of the data, you're identifying lifestyle issues that affect the property. I want to go to Etienne on this, obviously, because it goes to the heart of the person when it comes to this sort of data. And there was an example earlier on from this morning's sessions where a delegate pointed out they'd worked on a project with a HA where they could shut off remotely the boiler, and they saw it as a mechanism to effectively enable the tenant to give them access for compliance issues. And then someone else popped up and went, "Oh God, that seems awful. Surely that's a barrier." So could you expand, Etienne, on this kind of if it finds lifestyle issues with tenants, again, it comes down to the person and the technology. You're muted, by the way. If you look at the bottom, mic on. Oh no! Still can't hear you, Etienne. Oh no! You'll have to play around with the technology because at the bottom it usually says mic on, unless.
Stuart, do you mind if I ask Dean a question in the interim, if that's okay? I'm interested to know in terms of the use of the LoRaWAN sensors at Mid Wales HA. Obviously, there's some kind of change of people's day-to-day experience at work in which they're looking at data instead of just speaking to people about things, which is obviously the benefit of deploying IoT. How many people and to what extent would you say that their day-to-day job has changed?
it's still very much in the kind of development experimental stage at the moment, but yeah, we're getting a lot of ideas coming in work all the time that we can monitor this remotely and that. So fire alarm systems, we're really keen to get a hold of some LoRaWAN smoke detectors as well and monitor carbon monoxide remotely. So a lot of ideas floating up. Development with the new properties, they're passive houses, so they're really interested to see how efficient they are and if the systems are working correctly in there. For the maintenance side as well, they can tell if the heat recovery system's been turned on or off, or the settings have been changed, so we can see all that remotely. Yeah, it's really starting to take off.
And so is it like trigger based? Is there like a notification, an email, whatever, saying that this is a problem, rather than somebody, engineer, for example, looking at a screen and saying, this looks like a problem?
That's correct. Yeah, the dashboards I've created, they've got alerts and triggers in there, so they'll alert the relevant person when a parameter goes out of tolerance.
Fantastic.
We do want to get it fully integrated with the housing management system going forward. That'll be a huge step.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks. Good save there. I'm hoping Etienne is able to speak to us. So yes, go on, Etienne. We were talking about lifestyle, data telling, potentially a negative lifestyle or something. So,
Yeah, so sorry, I don't know why the mute wasn't working. So if I understand the case study was that there was a smart boiler and the landlord was able to turn it off or on demand. And I guess the tenants probably saw that as a punitive measure, right? So yeah, I mean, those things exist, I suppose, and that goes back to what I was trying to say earlier, is that it has to be a dialogue between the tenants and the landlord. If the landlord has a reason to want to do these things, it must be extra clear why these devices are installed, and particularly because the tenants, housing associations need to realize that the tenants are the first in line when things are going to go wrong. And things will always go wrong. I have never yet to see an IoT device that is easy to install, that works like that, and that doesn't crash when there is an update. I think that the best security measure is the design of the devices, because they always crash, and so there is no hacker that can use them. But my point is that whenever there is something that's going to go wrong, even if the landlord, if it's a really useful data for the landlord, the user will be the one who have to live with the consequences of the device going wrong. And so I think that's the manufacturer, the landlord who install these devices, they need to realize that this is the case and enter into a real discussion with the tenants to explain why they need this data, how they're going to be using it, even if it's to enforce rules, right?
So do you think that presents a challenge for a HA? Because I think what you do, what's been coming out in this kind of thread is very much that it can't be a passive thing. You can't just, as an organization say, we're going to put sensors in every single property without really involving the tenant and getting them to have a connection with that, with why stuff's in there. Do you see that as a potential barrier?
Definitely, yeah. This is what I meant earlier. Yeah. It is definitely, I think, the biggest barrier. And also you have to realize that the tenants are not necessarily passive in all these things, right? So once you have installed a smart boiler, the first thing that the tenant is going to do, especially if they know that it has some sort of a punitive rule enforcing, is try to see how it works. And what happens if I unplug this thing, right? And you don't want that. You want to be in the same team. And I guess that's a message that the housing association needs to transmit to the tenants, is that you're all playing on the same team here. You all want the property to be to have a lifelong happy osmosis of some kind, right? You do want the tenants to be in a property that is healthy that's it's really a teamwork, I think.
I mean, it's something that I get quite excised about. That, you know, before, when the conversation around IoT was starting, it was very much, this is not for social housing. This is not for social housing tenants. The kind of old, kind of very, you know, patriarchal approach, you know. I think if IoT is becoming more widespread in our own lives, you know, whether it be through things like Alexa or smart cars or smart doorbells or whatever, then if it's good enough for us, it's good enough for anyone. You know, it doesn't matter what kind of tenure you've got. Tom, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I just wanted to build on your points that have just been made. Is that it is so? Yes, social housing tenants should have the same technology that we have in our own houses, but we're actually through this discussion, we haven't talked about the same kind of technology that we do have in our own houses. We're talking about the kind of technology that you can get as a younger driver, having a black box in your car in which your insurer can penalise you if you're driving or is wrong. So I go back to this same view that IoT is really about enabling the silent background services that we provide and making sure that we continue to be able to provide those services in the background without disturbing the tenants. The most common reason why people end their tenancies in social housing is death. These are people's homes for their life. And they will invest in those homes. They will buy their own smart technology for their own consumer use. So for a big part of it, from my perspective, is that if they want those things in their home, then they are entitled to.
No, I agree. We're coming towards the end of our hour, so I just want to, for the last kind of 3 or 4 minutes, go around again the panel with the final question, which is, now, bearing in mind, 3 of the panel have said no, this isn't the year of IoT, and 3 have said yes. If we'll just assume, if a housing organisation was looking to plan for an IoT project this year, or let's say 2021, what would your advice be to them? And I'm going to start with Annalise.
I think, first of all, you need to do a proper assessment of your housing stock, find out what you have and how it works. And once you have that, find out who actually lives in your property and what the life of that property is going to be. And from that, you can deduce, hopefully using engagement with the occupants, what a strategy for IoT in your estate will be. Define that on what you want it to be in 50 years, and then devise the interventions accordingly. So those would be my 3 takeaways, I guess. The Brilliant. Property, the people, and where it should be in 50 years.
Brilliant. Thanks, Annalise. Dane?
2 things, really. One is keep it simple. Keep it really simple, and don't try and get lots of different benefits out of it straight away. And 2 would be just engage with all of the different players, make sure that the people at the top of the organization know about it, work with as many different parts of the organization, and try and tell them about the benefits and engage with the tenants.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Tom?
So my advice is to look at high risk, high cost service contracts, spend some time reimagining how that service should be delivered in the best possible way in the 21st century, and understanding the nuance and risk appetite of your particular housing association or business. You need to form a really clear strategy about how you want to deliver that change in that area in the next 3, 5, and 10 years. It's about having long-term goals rather than kind of short-term.
No, brilliant. Thanks, Tom. Etienne?
2 things probably. One would be to not go on the internet to figure out what sensors exist, so that because otherwise you'll find things that you may be interested in, and then you install them at great cost, and then you're like, well, it's not actually very useful. So, but do it the other way around. I think that's probably the approach that Dean has done. Is they figured out how they could make a device or setup, because they already had an issue about temperature. They identified the problem and then figured out what devices would actually solve that problem. And because the device didn't exist, they made it up. And it's not that difficult, right? And so I guess the first advice is to pinpoint the problem and how you think that you can benefit before you actually go online and figure out what exists. The second advice is, at every point in this ideation phase, you need to involve the tenants to make sure that they understand what is going on, and that they will be supportive, because it will go wrong. I mean, trust me, it will go wrong, and you need their support in order to make this thing a success.
No, thanks, Etienne. Dean?
Great. Yeah, I'm really passionate and excited about IoT. It's definitely the way forward. Don't be scared to change the ways you've been working on the housing side of it. Dane's got a great point there. Just keep it simple. Start with just asset monitoring, property monitoring, and go from there. Get creative, get everybody involved, and ideas obviously involving the tenants and what they think of it as well. But yeah, don't be scared. Just start experimenting, and you'll think of new ways of doing things, and that's the secret of it. And yeah.
No, thanks so much. And as this is my conference, I get the last word. Haha. That's what my wife always says. I always have to have the last word. In all things technology, when it comes to advice, I always say, you've got to get the executive engaged. They've got to not see technology as a silo that's given to the techie people of the business. It has to be integrated to your overarching strategy, because otherwise it will never get the buy-in. It will never get the take up. It will always be seen as sitting in this little techie IT box. So my advice is, if you're thinking about doing it, make sure you get your executive engaged. And I don't just mean the operational executive, I mean your board members as well. They've got to see it, that this is something that's going to keep the association or the registered provider going, as Annelise said, for the next 50 years. So on that note, thank you very much to the panel. We do have a wrap-up session after lunch. Lunch is only 30 minutes. So I would say to the panel, if you can come back on, it would be great, because there's a couple of points I've made, both from looking at the questions coming from the delegates, but also what you brought out, that it'd be great just to spend sort of 10, 15 minutes going back into. So if you can come back on after lunch, that would be brilliant. But thank you very much. Thank you to Annelise. Thank you to Dane. Thank you to Tom. Thank you to Etienne, and thank you to Dean. I hope everyone's had a good time. Thanks very much.
Cheers, everyone.
Lunch.
Bye.
Bye.